Before the world learned how to name the seasons, there was a girl who belonged entirely to the light. Persephone walked through fields that never questioned her presence. Flowers opened without hesitation beneath her steps, and the earth responded to her touch as if it recognized something of itself in her. She was not yet a goddess in the way mortals would later understand divinity. She was potential, movement, a beginning that did not yet know it would ever have to end. This is how most stories choose to remember her. As a daughter, as a maiden, as spring itself. But that is not where Persephone's story truly begins. It begins in the space between certainty and change, in the moment when belonging starts to feel incomplete. Even in the endless warmth of her mother's world, there were silences Persephone could not name. Moments when the sunlight felt almost too constant, too unchanging, as if something in her was waiting for contrast. She did not speak of this longing. She did not understand it well enough to explain it. She only felt it as a quiet pull, like a question the earth itself had not yet answered. Demeter saw only abundance, growth without interruption, life unbroken by loss. And for a time, that was enough. The world bloomed endlessly under her care, and Persephone moved through it like a promise that would never be tested. But nothing in the universe remains untouched by change forever. Not even spring. There are moments, soft, nearly invisible ones, when a life shifts direction long before anything actually happens. Persephone stood at the edge of such a moment without knowing it. She listened to the wind not as sound, but as suggestion. She noticed how shadows gathered beneath roots, how the soil held more than just seeds. She was beginning to see downward. This story is not about a scream tearing through the earth. It is not about a god stealing what did not belong to him. Those are the shapes fear gives to transformation when it cannot accept it. This is a story about becoming, about leaving a place without abandoning it, about entering darkness without losing oneself, about learning that growth does not only move upward toward the sun. Persephone's life would come to exist in tension between light and stillness, between her mother's world and a realm she had not yet imagined. And in that tension she would discover a truth few are taught gently, that innocence is not destroyed by change. It is expanded by it. Tonight, if you find comfort in stories like this, stories meant to be listened to slowly, to be felt rather than followed, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe to Sleevel so more quiet journeys can meet you here whenever night falls. There is no rush. The story will remain with you, so allow your thoughts to soften. Let the brightness of the day dim just enough. You are not leaving the light behind. You are simply allowing another part of the world to exist. And when you are ready, we will begin where Persephone first learned that to belong to life fully, one must also learn how to walk into its shadow without fear. Persephone did not wake one morning and decide to change her destiny. Change came to her the way dusk comes to a field, slowly, without announcement, soft enough that no one thinks to resist it. In the early days, she lived entirely within her mother's world. Demeter's realm was not merely land, it was rhythm. Everything followed a cycle of planting, blooming, and harvest that felt eternal. Persephone moved through this world as if she were both guest and extension of it, her laughter blending with birdsong, her footsteps barely bending the grass. To mortals she would later be called the goddess of spring. But in those days she did not rule anything. She observed, she listened, she learned the language of growth not through command, but through closeness. Demeter loved her with a devotion that bordered on fear. Not fear of harm, nothing in that world threatened Persephone, but fear of loss. Demeter had shaped the earth with care, so meticulous that even decay felt like betrayal. She taught Persephone that life was something to be protected, preserved, held at its peak for as long as possible. And Persephone believed her. She believed that beauty was meant to remain, that warmth was the natural state of existence, that endings were interruptions rather than necessities. Yet even surrounded by abundance, Persephone noticed small unsettling details. Flowers that bloomed too long lost their scent. Fruit left unharvested grew heavy and fell, bruised by the ground. Roots, unseen and ignored, carried most of the labor while receiving none of the praise. At night, when Demeter slept and the fields rested, Persephone sometimes wandered alone. She would kneel and press her fingers into the soil, feeling its cool depth beneath the surface warmth. There was something comforting there, a stillness that did not demand growth, did not rush toward the sun. She did not yet know why this comfort felt almost forbidden. The other gods watched Persephone as one might watch the horizon, aware of its beauty, but not curious enough to question what lay beyond it. She was gentle, quiet, unassuming, too light, some thought, to bear weight, too kind to understand necessity. Hades watched differently. From his realm below, he sensed changes before they reached the surface. Death was not chaos to him, it was order of a different kind. He felt the imbalance forming long before Demeter noticed anything amiss. Life accumulated without release, souls lingered without rest. The earth strained beneath abundance that never resolved into stillness. And somewhere above, a presence moved that did not belong fully to either extreme. Persephone's name reached him not through prayer, but through silence, the kind of silence that follows when something essential has not yet found its place. He did not desire her as conquest. He recognized her as necessity. This distinction matters, though myths often forget it. Meanwhile, Persephone's days continued, luminous and repetitive. She laughed easily, spoke kindly, learned quickly. But something within her grew restless, like a seed planted too shallow, longing for depth. She began to ask questions Demeter did not like. What happens to the flowers when they are gone? Where does the warmth go when the sun sets? Does the earth ever get tired of growing? Demeter answered gently but firmly. There is no need to dwell on such things. Life continues. That is enough. But it was not enough for Persephone anymore. She started noticing cracks, not fractures, but openings, places where light did not reach, places where something else existed, quietly, without apology. She did not fear these spaces. She felt drawn to them. One afternoon she wandered farther than usual, beyond the cultivated fields into land less carefully tended. The air felt different there, cooler, heavier. The ground held shadows longer. Wildflowers grew in uneven clusters, not arranged, not perfected. She felt more herself there than she ever had among endless symmetry. As she bent to touch a dark petaled bloom, the earth beneath her seemed to breathe. Not move, not break, just open. What followed would later be called an abduction. But in truth, there was no violence in the moment itself, no chaos, no tearing. The world simply shifted as it always does when something finds where it belongs. The ground lowered her gently, like a deep exhale. Light thinned, sound softened. Persephone did not scream, not because she was brave, but because fear had not yet arrived. What she felt instead was recognition. The descent was long but not frightening. Darkness wrapped around her not as absence, but as presence. It did not erase her shape, it outlined it. For the first time, Persephone felt seen without being displayed. When she reached the underworld, she did not collapse. She stood. Hades did not greet her with dominance. He did not rush toward her. He waited still, composed, respectful. He understood thresholds. He knew that crossing them changed both sides. "You are not lost," he said quietly, "but you are no longer where you began." Persephone looked around. The underworld was not what she had imagined in half-formed dreams. It was not cruelty, it was order. Vast, silent, heavy with meaning, souls moved with purpose, not despair. Stillness existed without stagnation. She felt something settle inside her. "I didn't mean to come," she said. Hades nodded. Few who arrive ever do. He did not ask her to stay. He did not ask her to leave. He offered neither threat nor promise. He allowed her to observe, to feel, to understand. And Persephone did understand, slowly, instinctively. This realm was not the opposite of life. It was its foundation, where endings were held with dignity, where release was not punishment, but completion. Yet above them, Demeter felt the rupture immediately. The earth screamed in her grief, crops withered, Rivers slowed. Growth became painful rather than generous. Demeter searched, demanded, mourned, but grief, when untempered by acceptance, becomes devastation. Persephone felt this sorrow like a distant ache. She did not rejoice in it, but she could not deny what she was learning below. She was not being erased, she was being expanded. Days, or something like days, passed. Persephone learned the names of stillness. She learned that power did not always speak, that authority could be quiet, that darkness was not evil, only honest. And slowly, without anyone declaring it, she began to change. Not into something colder, but into something deeper. When she finally ate the pomegranate seeds, it was not hunger that guided her, it was consent. She understood what they meant. To eat was to choose complexity, to accept division, to belong to more than one truth at once. She did not eat them because she was trapped. She ate them because she was awake. And somewhere in the silence between realms, Persephone ceased to be only a daughter of spring. She became a queen in waiting. The world would resist this truth. The myths would simplify it, but Persephone herself would never forget that her life did not break when it entered darkness. It began to hold weight. And in that weight she found balance. A balance the world above and below had been missing all along. Persephone did not return immediately. The underworld does not measure time the way the surface does. There are no mornings there, no obvious endings to nights. Instead, there is continuity, a sense of existence unfolding without urgency. At first, Persephone found this disorienting. She had grown accustomed to growth announcing itself, buds breaking open, seasons declaring their arrival with color and sound. Here, change whispered. She walked beside rivers that did not shimmer, but remembered. The waters carried stories rather than reflections. Souls passed quietly, not pleading, not lost. Each one moved with the calm inevitability of something that had been completed. This disturbed her more than chaos ever could have. Above, Demeter raged against the sky, but below, Persephone began to listen. Hades remained present without intrusion. He governed not through command, but through consistency. His realm did not need spectacle, it required balance. Persephone watched him receive the newly dead, watched him enforce boundaries even when compassion tempted him to bend them. She realized then that kindness without limits was not kindness. It was neglect. No one had ever taught her this. In Demeter's world, love meant endless giving. Here, love meant responsibility. Persephone began to walk the borders of the underworld, places where souls hesitated, unsure whether they were ready to release what they had been. She found that her presence steadied them. She did not force them forward. She reminded them that endings were not failures. This was not power she had sought. It was power that recognized her. She noticed that Hades never called her queen. He never even implied it. Titles in his realm were earned through function, not proclamation. Yet others, ancient spirits, keepers of thresholds, even the fates, began to regard her differently. They spoke to her not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. And Persephone felt the weight of that belonging settle into her bones. She thought often of her mother. The ache had not dulled. If anything, it had sharpened into clarity. Persephone could feel the imbalance above, the land straining under grief that refused to rest. She understood Demeter's pain now more fully than she ever had before. Love that clung too tightly could starve the world. She began to wonder whether her absence was not just loss, but instruction. The seeds within her stirred. One day, as she stood near the asphodel fields, she realized something unsettling. The underworld was responding to her presence. Not blooming, never that, but softening. Shadows bent gently around her path. Silence felt less oppressive. Even the dead seemed to remember something warm when she passed. She carried spring inside her still. But now it was tempered. Hades noticed the shift. "You bring something with you," he said one evening, his voice as steady as stone, "something this realm has not held before." Persephone considered this. "I didn't leave it behind," she replied. "I brought it with me." He nodded, understanding more than she had said. Their bond was not forged in passion, as mortals would later claim, but in recognition. Two forces that understood necessity from different angles. Where Persephone had once feared endings, she now respected them. Where Hades had ruled without hope, he now saw renewal not as threat, but as counterpart. Yet the world above could not endure this separation forever. Zeus, ever the mediator of conflict he had helped create, finally intervened. The earth's suffering had reached even Olympus. Crops failed, mortals cried out. Not to Hades, but to Demeter, whose grief had become famine. Balance demanded resolution. The decree came not as punishment, but compromise. Persephone would return to the surface, but not entirely. The seeds she had eaten had bound her to the underworld. She would divide her existence as the world itself is divided. When Persephone learned this, she did not weep. She understood. She had become something that could not exist in only one realm. Her return was quieter than her descent. When she rose from the earth, Demeter ran to her, relief flooding the land with green. Flowers burst open, as if trying to apologize for their absence. Fields exhaled. But Persephone felt the difference immediately. The sun felt brighter than she remembered. Too bright. She smiled, she embraced her mother, she walked the familiar paths, but she no longer disappeared into the fields. She noticed the way growth demanded decay, the way life leaned toward exhaustion without rest. Demeter sensed the change. "You are different," she said, not accusing, afraid. "I am more," Persephone replied gently. Spring returned, but it was no longer endless. Summer followed. Autumn came with its quiet surrender. And when Persephone descended again, winter settled not as cruelty, but as rest. For the first time the world breathed. Persephone learned to move between realms without breaking. She learned that belonging did not require singularity. She was daughter and queen, light and shadow, beginning and release. Mortals would later tell her story as loss and return, as innocence stolen and partially restored. But Persephone knew the truth. She had not been taken. She had been invited into complexity, into responsibility, into a life large enough to hold both joy and gravity. And each time she descended, the underworld welcomed her not as a visitor, but as its balance made visible. Each time she rose, the earth learned again that life is precious because it is not permanent. This was not a tragedy. It was a cycle. And Persephone at its center had finally learned how to turn. With time, Persephone learned that returning was not the same as arriving. Each descent into the underworld reshaped her slightly, and each ascent to the surface carried echoes of what she had left behind. The world insisted on seeing her as divided, but Persephone felt herself becoming more whole with every crossing. She was no longer pulled between realms, she was the bridge that allowed them to exist without tearing apart. Still, bridges are not places of rest. In the months she spent above, Persephone walked among mortals more often than before. She listened to their prayers, not from a distance, but nearby, felt in their voices the fear of endings and the desperation to hold on. They prayed to Demeter for abundance, to Zeus for protection, to any god who promised continuation. Very few prayed for release. Persephone understood why. Letting go is harder than growing. She noticed how people spoke of death in hushed tones, as though silence itself could delay it. They clung to youth, to harvest, to warmth. And when winter arrived, they cursed the cold rather than recognizing it as the world's need to sleep. Her presence among them was subtle. She did not announce herself as queen of the underworld. She appeared as a woman with a calm gaze, a voice that did not rush. In her nearness, grief softened, fear loosened its grip. Some felt compelled to confess losses they had never spoken aloud. They did not know why. Above, Demeter watched her daughter with a complicated heart, pride mingled with sorrow. Persephone no longer needed protection. She carried authority not inherited, but earned. Demeter sensed that her own power, once absolute in its domain, now required restraint. This was the hardest lesson of all. To love without control, to nurture without possession, to allow change without interpreting it as betrayal. The seasons settled into rhythm, but the tension between mother and daughter never disappeared entirely. It transformed instead into understanding edged with longing. Below, Hades noticed a different change. The underworld no longer felt static. Persephone's presence introduced movement. Not chaos, but evolution. The dead remembered themselves more gently. The newly arrived found orientation sooner. The realm itself seemed less burdened by the weight it carried. Yet Hades remained unchanged in one crucial way. He did not claim Persephone as something he owned. When others spoke of her as queen, he allowed it. When they spoke of her as bride, he remained silent. Titles mattered less to him than function, and Persephone functioned steadily, wisely, without spectacle. Their conversations were quiet, often unfinished. "What do you miss?" he once asked. Persephone thought carefully. "Ignorance," she answered at last. "It was lighter." Hades nodded. "But less useful."
"Yes," she said, "and lonelier."
As Persephone grew into her role, she began to understand a truth few gods confronted willingly. Power is not about dominion, it is about stewardship. She did not rule the underworld by decree, she shaped it through presence, through discernment, through knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. She became keeper of thresholds, not just between life and death, but between holding on and letting go. This did not go unnoticed. Some gods grew uneasy. Persephone's influence was quiet, difficult to challenge. She did not demand worship, yet mortals spoke her name with a strange mix of fear and gratitude. She was not a god to bargain with, but one to trust when nothing else remained. Even Zeus watched her more carefully now. Persephone did not enjoy this attention. She preferred the margins, the spaces where transitions occurred unseen. But she accepted the responsibility that came with being visible. In the underworld, she began to preside over judgments, not of guilt, but of readiness. Not every soul clung to life. Some resisted release fiercely. Persephone learned how to wait with them, to offer stillness rather than force. This patience was her greatest strength, and it came at a cost. She felt the weight of every farewell. Every soul that crossed the river carried a fragment of her attention with it. She absorbed endings the way she once absorbed sunlight, quietly, completely. At times she wondered if this would hollow her out. It did not. It deepened her. One winter, as she prepared to descend again, Persephone paused longer than usual at the threshold. The earth above lay bare, resting. Demeter stood beside her, saying nothing. Words were no longer necessary. "I will return," Persephone said. "I know," Demeter replied. "That's what frightens me now." Persephone smiled, not sadly, but honestly. It shouldn't. She stepped downward. The underworld welcomed her like a held breath finally released. Hades stood where he always did. Not waiting, exactly, but present. Persephone joined him, and the realm settled. Together they governed not as rulers above subjects, but as guardians of process. Life would continue, death would arrive, and between them Persephone would stand, not torn, not diminished, but fully aware that wholeness is not the absence of darkness. It is the ability to carry it without losing the light. As centuries passed, Persephone discovered that immortality did not mean sameness. The world above shifted in ways she had never been taught to anticipate. Cities rose where forests once breathed freely. Mortals learned to shape stone, to record memory, to name their fears and call them knowledge. They told stories about the gods not to understand them, but to tame them. And Persephone's story changed with each telling. To some she became a warning, to others a tragedy, to many a symbol stripped of her voice. They spoke of her as if she were forever young, forever taken, forever divided against her will. Few imagined her as someone who chose complexity over comfort. Persephone listened. She did not correct them. In the underworld she felt the consequences of these misunderstandings. Souls arrived carrying shame about dying, guilt about leaving life behind. They treated death as failure rather than completion. As the night settles more deeply around you, there is no need to hold on to every thought. Persephone's story was never meant to be followed closely, only felt like the slow turning of seasons, like the quiet understanding that arrives when the world finally grows still. If her journey brought you a sense of calm, if it helped loosen the weight of the day, allow that feeling to remain with you as you rest. Here on Sleever, stories are told not to awaken the mind, but to soften it, to offer a gentle place where thought can slow and sleep can arrive naturally. If you would like more quiet journeys like this, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe to the channel so these stories can find you again. On another night, there is nothing more you need to do. Let your breathing deepen. Let the darkness feel safe. Tomorrow will return in its own time. For now, may your rest be untroubled, your sleep unbroken, and your dreams gentle. Good night.